Well, hiya. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm a freelance writer. I used to be a sociologist at Queen's. I got sick. They didn't sack me in case 200. And so I've been really for the best part of 25 years researching and telling people's stories. A lot of those stories have been quite hard to find and tell. I started off researching religion and politics. I spent a lot of time with conservative evangelicals and then people who'd left the faith. Researched with gay Christians, with former combatants at the beginning of the peace process. I'm working on a book at the minute about modern dissenters, the spirit of 1798 in the 21st century. So all of those have really been stories that haven't necessarily been that easy to find or tell, but they have been challenging and illuminating and quite liberating in many ways. So I'm going to talk this evening. Let me just work on how to do this. Just a couple of minutes at the start and talk about why telling hidden stories, why I think it's important. Then I'm going to give you just like a worked example from my own kind of writing and work, just to get who's down the side here. Yeah. Just to get really one of the most hidden stories that I've researched, just to give you an idea of how many layers and nuances in terms of what you can find, even from a very, very slim starting point. And then most importantly, at the end, I'll spend about 20 minutes just trying to share some of the tips and techniques that I stumbled across over my journeys of telling stories, and hopefully some things in there that will help you unlock that you want to tell about Cregagh too. So why do hidden stories matter, apart from just being really, really interesting? I think, just to keep it brief, official history is one set of stories. I'm sure when you went to school and when I went to school, we all did the history of the kings and queens and world wars and big political events and political leaders and things like that. My kids in P6, and the history curriculum is still like that. So it's really dominated by people who've had access to power. Also, people who've been educated enough and had the literacy and resources to tell their stories. Now, those stories have absolutely shaped us, stories of war and those big historical moments, and they're really important to understand, and there's still more we need to find out about them. But there's also a lot of people whose stories maybe didn't get included in those telling of history, those tellings of history the first time around. Many, many unheard voices. Working class people is a huge example. Like if I think about my family 100 years ago, there wouldn't have been many of them who were literate. And maybe talk a little bit about that later on. So they didn't keep diaries, they didn't send letters. There's nothing kind of their stories that was written down for historians to later stumble upon and archive and write up. Women's histories, you've clearly been talking about that with Lisa in other sessions. Again, didn't really get a good crack of the whip, but inputting into the story or understanding of these big historical moments the first time around. I think because women's lives are just seen as domestic and private and maybe less important or interesting to write about. But there is a whole subgenre of history that is dedicated to just this, telling ordinary people's stories and filling in those gaps, so that we can kind of get a more rounded version of historical events and times and places, so that we can see things from a load of different angles and attempt to understand it better. So folklore is one of those, and that maybe sounds like finding out about leprechauns and fairies, but it's not. It's just people who go into their local communities, like you guys, and document and write down everybody's stories and their memories and every scrap of information so that it's not lost. And that's a really thriving discipline. Sociology and anthropology, which I've spelt wrong, that's my background. It's a different way of kind of gathering contemporary stories with a view to analysing them. Oral history, vernacular history, loads of people doing that kind of work, kind of just inserting ordinary people back into the dominant narratives. And journalism, some of the best things I've read about Northern Ireland have been written by journalists, like Susan McKay's book about Northern Protestants, or Fionnuala O'Connor doing the same thing with Catholics in search of a state. You know, just that feeling of being taken by the hand by a journalist into somebody's kitchen or into the pub and hearing all these stories from that are very ordinary and everyday that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. So those are the kind of stories I love. And it's exciting that you get the chance to put your stories into the work here as well. So centenary stories, this is just an example. Maybe we're sick to death talking about it, but I thought it was a good example, and I've included it because it's one of the most hidden stories I've worked on. These are all my great grannies here, my great granny. And I'm a writer and I write about politics. So there's kind of a pressure to write into the political moment. So my granddad was a great hoarder, and he kept loads of kind of suitcases and shoe boxes in the attic, and then everybody gave them to me as houses were moved out of and things. So I was sitting down thinking, I got to write something for the centenary, and flicking through his suitcases and shoe boxes, and all the expected stuff was in there. There were a good few war heroes, war letters. I had a UUP election agent great granddad, and I was sort of looking through these and thinking to myself, I've heard these stories before, and I might go back to those because they're full of interest and there will be layers yet to be discovered. But as I was thinking about what to write, we were all in lockdown. And my kids were doing my head in. They were coming in every 10 minutes. I was having to squeeze toothpaste or mop up milk or give somebody a hug. And I just had this tiny moment of revelation. What were the women in my family doing 100 years ago? Were they also trying to balance this kind of domestic life with this huge political moment that was going on outside their front doors? And so that kind of led to a journey of, I chose all the women in my family and decided to look at all their lives and excavate as much information as I could about them. So I'm going to talk a wee bit just about the Gibney family in the Shankill Road. They're kind of one of my favourite families. But the other reason I've chosen to talk a wee bit about them tonight is because I had no starting point. I had one name, and that was Dora Gibney, who's my great grandmother. That's her here on the left. My granddad gave me that photo just a couple of weeks ago. I'd never seen it before. So I had one name. There were no family stories. Literally, my granny never talked about it. So I was starting from scratch. So when you start from scratch, obviously the first place you go is the census. And here she is in 1911. You can see Dora Gibney. And she's old, and she's a linen weaver. Now I wanted to go back a bit further because like there's my great grandmother Maria Gibney, and she's 50 at the time, and she's had 7 children. She would go on to have 8. And then I was trying to think, how can I access like their political worlds at the time? Okay, so a bit about their jobs. They lived, I forgot to say, it doesn't say in this sentence, but they lived in Carnan Street on the Shankill Road. Is kind of near where the Shankill Spectrum Centre is now. So I thought, right, were they interested in politics? Let's go and have a nosy at the Ulster Solemn Covenant. The Women's Declaration was the equivalent. And here we have Dora here, 33 Carnan Street, and Maria Gibney down at the bottom, signing the declaration. And you can see that Maria signs with only her mark, meaning that she couldn't write, same as Eliza Moffat here in the top row. And I was thinking, that's interesting. What else can I access about what was going on in their political worlds at the time? And I had an address, Carnan Street. So a pal of mine suggested, go and look at the newspaper archives, see if you can find any information about what was going on in the streets where they were living. So borrowed Lisa's login to the British newspaper archive and found loads of things that were going on in Carnan Street. There were processions and parades, there were riots. This on the left is a portrait of Edward Carson, and that was being painted on the very like gable wall where my great granny lived. And one of their neighbours, Francis Cregagh, a Catholic guy from Kerry, he was shot outside their house for talking back to the army. So I'm beginning to paint a portrait in my head of Maria Gibney's life, up in the Shankill, interested in politics, and even if not, there's definitely like a kind of feeling of a political swell happening outside her front door. And I thought, I wondered, did she vote in the 1921 election? Because women got the right to vote in 1918 for the first time, the Representation of the People Act. So I had a wee nosy then at where she was living and what the rent books were. This one was a wee bit harder to uncover, but all this information is on PRONI. And so you can see here, this is Carnan Street, and this is number 33, and this is her bloke, Archie Gibney. And you can see that the value of their land was their rent, their annual rent was £5.10. So Maria was old enough to vote, and she passed the property threshold, just kind of squeaked over it. So that was really interesting. Whether or not she voted, I don't know, of course, but I do know that she would have struggled to read the ballot. Kind of came to a bit of a halt then on Maria, so I thought I'll have a look at the other family members and see what they were up to. This is, again, the census from 1911. Am I talking too fast, or is it okay? Okay. And here we have Archibald Gibney. That's a big family name, so there's Archibald Gibneys everywhere, but this is Maria's eldest son, and he's married Elizabeth Gibney here. And what we can tell about her life, she was 31. She's already had 10 children. Only 7 of those were still living. We can see that her eldest daughter here, Sarah, she's 14, and she's already a rope worker. So that tells me something interesting about their lives. Because it's the census, and then you've got Lennon Wily, which is the street directory, it's able to track back all of the streets and the roads that the family had lived on over the years. One that kept coming up was Handsworth Street in the lower, it's more kind of central, lower Shankill. So if you can find the streets that your people lived on or that you're interested in Cregagh, you'd be amazed what historical archives are online. So here's Handsworth Street, which actually looks a bit tidier than I thought, big kind of cobbled alleys. But then here's like a little back alley of Handsworth Street with much less going on in the way of window panes and shoes for the kids. So that was interesting to me, to begin to get like a visual idea of the kind of streets and places that they might have lived and what their lives might have been like. Went back to the newspaper archives then to search their names to see if I could find out anything that way. And unfortunately, I found some sad things, some very sad things. Archibald Gibney, here he is on the left-hand side, right? There he is in Hemsworth Street. And this is Archie being brought up into court for not sending his kids to school. And that is not the only newspaper entry where Archibald Gibney finds himself in court. Here he is on the right-hand side, the Vaccination Act in 1912. By now he's living in Hindford Street in East Belfast, but he's not got his kids vaccinated. And in fact, this newspaper article relates to his daughter, Dora Gibbons. And the last little thing there at the end, that's Dora's death certificate. And she dies when she's 6 years old. So I don't know what she was supposed to be getting vaccinated for in 1912. She dies of nephritis, and that's a kidney something. So I don't know if these two things are connected, but certainly I'm thinking about Elizabeth Gibney's life here and starting to build up a picture of a life that was pretty difficult. And here she is, Elizabeth Gibney, and a couple of years later, and she's died herself. She was a shotgun wedding, got married herself, child bride at 16, not the only one, Lisa. And she had 13 children in total, and 7 of them died, and she died herself at the age of 34 of heart failure, it says here, heart syncope, atrophied. So she just basically dropped dead. And I mean, she wasn't then alive at the time of centenary or the formation of Northern Ireland, but starting to build up a much more layered and interesting picture of the women in my family at this time. I'm wondering actually how interested they were in politics, or if they had quite enough going on in the house. Coming back to where we started, Dora Gibbons, with my new photograph from my granddad. This is her, and this is the man she married, Andy McCandless. And you remember back on the census, she is working as a linen weaver in the 1911 census. And this is just a photo online of kind of girls around the same age. There were a lot of kind of children working in the mills. I actually called up to Carnan Street. I was doing a wee thing with the BBC, and we were outside the 33 Carnan Street where they used to live, when we rapped on the door. And the woman inside explained, and she just pointed over and said, like, there's Crumlin Road there, and there's Ewarts Mill, and I was doing linen at the time, and that's where all the girls who were living in the street worked. So that was amazing. And I found these pictures of Ewarts Mill, which is like a linen industrial complex, really, the size of it. I'm beginning to piece together a few parts about her life there. That's a picture of men, again, just this archives on the internet. I think they're maybe flax hackling there, separating out the fibers. This is a picture from Ewarts Mill. It looks like a few years later. And she looks like she's weaving linen to me. So probably something very similar to what great granny Dora did. So coming back to the political element of it all, we have Dora on the covenant, the declaration. So she signed up, she's living in Carnan Street at the time of partition. So I'm beginning to think and try and inhabit Dora's world and kind of imaginatively get into her shoes. But then I stumble on a couple of little mysteries. First one is going back to Archie and Elizabeth. All Dora's siblings spoke Irish. So here these guys are living in Shankill Road. You can see that Archibald and the kids are all speaking Irish. Elizabeth speaks Irish and English. They're Presbyterians. Elizabeth was, I think she was from Northern Ireland, but a family went over to England for work and she was born there. So why she's coming back with the two languages. Another kid in the family, there's James and Sarah, and you can see that they're speaking Irish and English as well. But by 1911, those were both the 1901 census. By 1911, if you look at the language column, it's like buried under your faces, but it's in there at the end there. They speak English. The Irish language has disappeared from their records. So that was a really interesting little mystery to me, to think the Shankill at this time, like I counted up the streets where they lived in, and there were less than 1% of Catholic neighbours. So it was almost monolithically a Protestant area at the time. And again, counting up on their streets, the amount of Irish speakers there were, up to 15% in some streets. And it just interested me that there was obviously a change from 1901 to 1911 in my family. And I don't know whether it was politics going on outside the front door, or if there was self-censorship, that they didn't want to say that they spoke Irish anymore. Very, very interesting. I also find that one of the earliest branches of the Northern Gaelic League was set up in the Shankill Road at the end of the 19th century. So it's quite possible they learned it at school and then they just stopped learning that at school. Another interesting layer that I found was that the family came from Sailortown initially. So that's all around the docks area of Belfast, part that's sort of under dual carriageway now, where the old Rotterdam bar was and stuff. They would all have lived in Earl Street and neighbouring areas. So a picture from the internet, it looks like, I don't know, maybe slightly less good quality housing than where they were living in the Shankill. Bit of community spirit going on in this image anyway, with Ring a Ring of Roses, but yeah, little in the way again of shoes. what was particularly grabbing about the sailor town element was intermarriage in the family, because I didn't know that my granny, this side of the family, had any mixed marriages at all. But somebody on ancestry.co.uk started to piece this together with all the marriage certificates, and then I went and replicated it and found all the families, and here we are, just a ton of marriages. Mary, I need to put my glasses on through these. Here's one, Archibald Gibson marrying Mary Haney in Ardoyne, who's Jane Gibney marrying Thomas Dinan in St. Patrick's Catholic Church in the city centre. Wilhelmina Gibney, she's marrying James Boyle in St. Patrick's. And basically then, if you track these people throughout, subsequent years, they just convert to Catholicism, and that's them. An interesting thing is that for the eagle-eyed, if you see the kids here, Jane Gibney, she goes down to 1B, and Wilhelmina Gibney, 1B. The people who convert to Catholicism keep the 1B, and those who stay Protestants go with the 2Bs. So sometimes you can pick up, like if we're talking about telling hidden histories and like tiny little clues that are left behind. That was something that enabled me to kind of trace the trajectories of the families. But my goodness, they mostly stay Protestant and they move up to the Shankill. And I can't trace the other families and their Catholic in-laws down in Sailortown, and they stayed in Sailortown. They didn't move up the Shankill with them. And whereas in Sailortown, their areas were somewhat religiously mixed. I am that person, I just counted it manually on the census, house by house. In Sailortown, about 20% of their neighbours were Catholics, and the Shankill it was less than 1%. So I kind of just think about their lives down in the city centre with aunties and uncles and cousins and all looking after each other's children, and this very kind of mixed and mingled life. And then how when they moved up the Shankill, they may be getting the better jobs in the mills, but there's a change that happens in the family, isn't there? There's kind of less connection, and the politics is changing at the time. And yeah, so for me, I don't know what I conclude from that, just that I find a family of who I think are gorgeous loyalist women who had pretty hard lives, hard work, whose lives were probably defined a lot by childbearing and child loss and child raising. But also that they had all these gorgeous, unexpected Irish cultural layers in terms of the Irish language and mixed marriage families. And so there was a lot more to their story than I was maybe expecting to find, and certainly a lot more than finding or just having one name, Dora Gibbons. So I hope that's an interesting example to share with you, just in the sense of how far you can get from a starting point of almost zero. And I know a lot of that is like inference and imagination and trying to just inhabit imaginatively the lives of people that you're trying to follow. But I think between the archive records and newspaper reports and the visuals and things, that you can begin to build up a fairly credible story of what might have happened at the time. Okay, so enough about me. Let's talk about you. How for you guys to find hidden stories. I'm hoping that most of you have an advantage that I didn't have with the Gibneys, in that you will know people to talk to, because the very best place to find stories is obviously through other people that keep the memories and have the stories. These are images of lovely people from AJNI's Twitter. And you'll all have somebody in your family. Maybe you are that person. It's probably you actually, because you're here. Or if it's not you, find the people in your family or your community that keep the memories, that keep the shoe boxes, that are hoarders, that clutter the place, that don't throw things out. And you'd be amazed what you can find. Attics and shoe boxes. Honestly, I saved so many things from the skip in my house, and these attics and shoeboxes are attics. No, these shoeboxes and suitcases from my granddad's attic have kept me writing for years and years. Often people keep things that as artifacts that maybe the family stories don't get told down because they're a bit difficult or a bit embarrassing or a bit silenced, maybe during the Troubles or something like that. But certainly in my suitcases, this is one that I find. It's William McBride from Newry, his Ulster Solemn League and Covenant, and it was tucked inside an Irish dancing book, which gave me a great insight into the kind of cultural mingling of my Newry family at that time. So, presuming that you do have people to interview, here are some ideas and tips and techniques that might be of use to you. Firstly, with interviewing, like I've been doing this 25 years, and every single time I go lift the phone or send the email, I have the absolute cringe. I feel so embarrassed and I'm really mortified to be asking people for their time and their stories, but force yourself to put that to one side, because really, genuinely, most people are just surprised that you're interested in their lives, and most people are very happy to share their stories. It's really important to get consent for any interviews you do. If you're doing it like in a university or in like an official capacity, you would have to like write out ethics things and get them to sign stuff off. I don't think, obviously, well, Lisa will tell you if you need to do that, but certainly like in non-university projects I'm doing, I'm just really careful to tell everybody why I want to talk to them, what I'm going to use it for, ask them, make sure they know the boundaries of what, you know, that I won't include anything that they don't want to. Sometimes you might want to bounce it back to people to see if they're happy with it. You don't always have to do that, depending on context. Sometimes you might want to bounce stories that after you've interpreted them and written them up back to people to fact check them as much as anything else and see if there's anything they want to add. It's really good to be flexible about the methods of interviewing, which is especially true during a time of global pandemic. This photograph is basically how I'm writing my book at the minute, which is COVID walks with dirty hiking boots and a flask of tea and some hand sanitizer. And I didn't expect to be writing a book that way, but the only way I'm able to talk to people at the minute is outside. And so that's what we've done, and it's worked out really well. There are other people at the minute with COVID, obviously, who are shielding, who aren't comfortable coming outside, even for a walk. So you can still interview those people with whatever method that you and they are comfortable with. There's one guy who lives in the Glens at the minute that I'm interviewing. He's really worried about his health, and he's also really shy, but he's brilliant at writing. So I'm interviewing him by WhatsApp message because it's really quick and immediate, and it's a handy way for him to communicate, and he feels like he expresses himself well like that. So be creative. I think pandemic means you need to be creative, and sometimes that can have kind of hidden bonuses for the type of stories that you find. In terms of tech and equipment, oh my goodness, things have evolved so much over recent years. At the minute, I'm just interviewing with my phone. There's a voice memo app on it, and I have a pair of headphones and just chuck them around somebody's neck, get them to put the phone in their pocket. There's a little microphone on it, and it's really subtle, and I think kind of the subtlety of it puts people at ease. Well, as at ease as people can be when you're interviewing them. Whenever I started doing interviews, it was just after the Good Friday Agreement, and we had to interview like the people who negotiated the agreement for a project I was working on in UCD. And the technology at the time was like this big, massive black DAT recorder. It was like a huge black TV in a box. And the very first interview I did, I had to get Jeffrey Donaldson scrambling underneath his office desk on all fours, trying to find a plug to get this thing functional. And then I took it to the Foreign Office in London to interview some diplomat, and I was so knackered because I was walking around London trying to do multiple interviews that I left this like big unattended black box in the Foreign Ministry in London. So things have changed a lot in recent years. So I would just encourage you not really, you don't need to buy special equipment, and almost the more lo-fi, like people are familiar with phones and headphones and things like that. Those things put people at ease, and the more subtle you can be, the better. It's probably better to make a backup if you can, have 2 phones running. I got into the car a few months ago and it said confirm, delete interview. I was like, ah. So always good to make a backup if that's possible, or take little notes. In terms of interviewing people themselves, tips that are pretty universal are to ask open-ended questions. There was a few slides ago, I think, a picture with Ambassador was that on the Cregagh Road. It was a cinema. So if you say you wanted to tell stories about the Ambassador cinema, instead of asking, do you remember the Ambassador cinema? Yes, no. Did you like it? Yes, no. If you can think of questions that, do you remember the first time that you went to the Ambassador cinema? What do you remember? What was it like? Or what was your favorite night out that you ever had there? Do you know, things that kind of provoke little synapses in the brain to bring stories and memories out, rather than asking closed questions that just lead to quite factual yes and no answers. Any questions you can design that get to memory and story. Something that I'm quite bad at, but which is a good interview technique, is to try to be quiet and try not to babble, and lean into the awkwardness. Because often when you're interviewing people, you're asking them a question and like they're not going to recall stuff instantly. It might take them a few minutes, or it might be a few days later they think of it. So you need to kind of give people time for the cogs to turn, and it's really awkward, isn't it? Because I just want to fill up all those silences and not feel weak. But if you can try to develop technique of just making encouraging noises, or that's fascinating, tell me more, or can you explain that? Things like that instead, to keep the conversation going. And often it's in those silences when you're feeling mortified that people can come up with new things that weren't the immediate thoughts that came to mind. Should you give people questions in advance? Totally up to you. I like it when people give me questions in advance, because I'm kind of an over-preparer. It gives people a chance to reflect on things over a few days. I'm sure you have it in conversations the whole time, like, I wish I'd said that, or you go home a few hours later and you remember something. So giving people questions in advance can be useful. I would never be afraid to ask stupid questions, because sometimes the stories you might want to tell are people that you know, or things that you think you know something about. But I would act as if you know nothing, because you might have got it wrong, or there might be multiple interpretations, or somebody might think in their head something different than the thoughts you described to them. So yes, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions and something sounds stupid. I would tend not to write down questions and come and read them out for people. If there's specific things that you need, definitely memorize those, or write them down if you feel you need to. But most people are happier telling stories when it feels kind of natural rather than official. I would also say the interview is like a moment in time. So like, don't think you have to have every T crossed and I dotted at the moment. Just follow up if you forgot to ask them something, and definitely invite them if any memories are triggered or any thoughts after the interview, after they've gone home, to keep in touch and have the interview as like a moment in a wider conversation. You'll probably find that there's more layers to come after the interview itself. Okay, so some creative techniques that might help get some of the hidden stories out. I was saying, like during lockdown, I've been going for these COVID walks with people. Usually that's not really something I would have considered. I would have just gone to somebody's house or their kitchen and had a cup of tea and talked about ideas over the kitchen table. And that's really good. And that's often where people are really comfortable. But I was thinking about Cregagh Connections and the types of stories that you might want to tell. And it struck me that this kind of location-based interviewing might be something that would be useful for you guys as well. So what I've been doing is just trying to think of places that mean something to people that might trigger stories. Because if you're sitting at your kitchen table, you've just kind of got your brain and your conversation and your ideas. If you're out and about and walking around, you've got smells, you've got sounds of the street, you've got all kinds of different memories that can be maybe triggered by different senses. And yeah, I think some of your stories, you never know, might lend themselves well to being done on a walk kind of a style. People might remember different pieces of information as you walk around. Objects is another really good way to get stories out of people. If it's hard just to come up with things naturally, because sometimes people feel like talking about themselves, but they can talk about things or places or objects comes to mind. I had a brilliant PhD student at Queen's called Frances King, and she was an elderly lady, and she wanted to, her topic was how has religion changed over the last kind of 3 generations in Northern Ireland. And how she did it is she went to people's houses and she asked if she could have a wee nosy at their trinkets and their knickknacks and their mantelpieces. And she took some photos with their permission, and that's what she used as her data for her PhD. And it was the most beautiful PhD I've ever read. And what she was finding was like, say people my grandparents' generation, she was mostly focusing on Catholics, that they would have had very kind of traditional religious objects in their houses. I always remember an old lady in her 80s, and she had a full-size statue of Mary, like in the hall of her house. And she said, I had the nose kissed off her. So the statue had physically worn down in the nose because like of the woman's kind of intimate and regular kind of relationship with the statue. And when she came to people probably like my parents' generation or in between me and my parents' generation, and that was the Troubles generation. So they still had all their kind of traditional Catholic pictures and bits and pieces and prayer cards and paraphernalia. But in the Troubles generation, people didn't want to display it as much. Maybe they didn't want to mark out their identity so clearly on the walls of the house, but still had a big emotional connection to the objects. So Frances was finding herself then in garages and in attics and in drawers and things being hauled out from under the beds, because they were things like traditional religious objects that people kept. Also, people began to see the objects as kitsch, and tastes changed, and as people changed social class, what they thought was an aesthetically attractive thing to display or not changed over time. So that was really interesting. And then when she came to like people kind of my age and younger, what she found was like these sort of more generic angels here on the right hand side, and things like forever friends, bears, you know, just kind of generic objects that took on some kind of spiritual meaning for people. Maybe they were meaningful for who had given them to them, or that they felt reflective or thoughtful when they spent time with these objects or whatever. So really, without Frances sitting down and having to have big, heavy chats with people about their religion, just by poking around their houses and chatting to them about their objects, it elicited just this gorgeous study of the change in religion down the generations. So you might not be able to go into people's houses with COVID. Maybe later on you will be able to, but I interviewed Lisa recently, who stuffed a backpack for me. Maybe people can bring objects out of their houses as well for you to have a look at and talk about those objects, and that could be something that worked for you. Another thing, I'm getting to the end here, but photographs. And again, like that's something maybe 60 years ago well, we wouldn't be having this conversation over Zoom, but you might have needed specialist equipment and to be kind of more expert to be able to take photographs. But now most of us have a camera in our pocket. And these photographs are from a documentary photographer friend of mine called Bill Kirk. And these are from a project he did in Sandy Row in the 1960s. And Bill is all about ordinary life and ordinary stories, right? And he's revisited Sandy Row recently. And like, there's the recent photograph. That scene looks so familiar, doesn't it? You know, the upholstery and the bar, the jumper the man's wearing, the pints of tenants, whatever. And Bill is all about just capturing the absolutely ordinary. And we should take photos of whatever you can now, even if it looks so banal and mundane and everyday to you, because in 60 years' time, now I can't put myself back, in 60 years' time, the really boring, banal photographs you'll take will be a portal in time, and it'll, for people in the future, it'll be like looking back at these photographs from Bill's 1960s work. I mean, the things you can tell here, new television sets and the multi-generational living here at tiny spaces. There's so much you can tell from the fashion and, you know, the bits that they have and everything. So use your cameras as much as you can so that you can take images of Cregagh now, and there won't be images that will be included maybe in big histories or big narratives of Belfast or Northern Ireland or, you know, post-peace, whatever, but it'll be a really authentic record that you'll have and be able to keep for future generations, which I think will really help people understand how ordinary people live today. Couple, just one, I think, last method, maps. I had a colleague called Madeline Leonard in Queens, and she was amazing. She was a sociologist of childhood, and how she did her work, she did it with like young people in and around Belfast. And she wanted to talk to Catholic and Protestant young people about their experiences of the city centre and sectarianism and how they used public space. And this is a map of Cregagh, but she gave them maps of the places where they lived, and she gave them a bunch of highlighter pens. And she asked all the kids to draw, mark out on the maps where they felt safe going, where they didn't feel safe going. And she just basically was able to build up this picture of how young people use the lamppost at the end of this road, going down to Jimmy's shop at the end of that road. She was able to get from the young people how even they recognized each other across tribes, if you like, through the type of jewelry that they would wear and the type of tracksuits that they would wear, and not just like the obvious kind of sporting tops. But she kind of was able to get this wealth of like a treasure trove of hidden information just with a map and highlighter pens. So like I have old maps of where I live. I just got from Amazon.com for a couple of quid. There's lots of 1901 maps that are available. So whatever, or Lisa will tell you about the PRONI historical year map. There might be something in that method for you, even if it's walking around historical map routes with people and trying to jog memories that way. I don't know what could be in that for you, but it could be a really useful research tool. I did a lot of the Gibney research through archives, but I don't think you need me to talk about archives tonight, do you? I think Lisa in other sessions says that you've been through it all.
Is that Claire that's frozen? Not me. Yeah.
Yeah, she's just frozen.
Oh. I'm sure she'll be back when she can.
all that. So hey,
Oh, you're back.
sorry about that. How far did we get? Did we get to the part where you don't need to know about archives?
We got to, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't need to know about archives bit. Perfect.
Okay. We didn't need to know that bit anyway, so that was a good time to freeze, serendipitous. So anyway, that's just some stuff about telling hidden stories. Some of you may want to go for the war stories or whatever stories are significant in your family, but hopefully there's some kind of tips and techniques in there at least that'll help you maybe access different layers of it or find different nuances in it, maybe things that you didn't know you would be looking for. And for others, hopefully that's some kind of inspiration, how far you can get in telling hidden stories with a very, very, very scant starting point. And yeah, some ideas of the ways that you can wheedle the stories out of people. So thank you for listening.